This is the second presentation for week 2, and it's entitled The Enlightened Road to Rebellion. In this presentation, we'll take an historical journey beginning with the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, moving forward into the Scientific Revolution, and then into the Enlightenment. We will also note the Great Awakening that occurred in especially the American colonies. The Enlightenment was a period in European history beginning around the late 17th century when people began to emphasize the use of one's own reason to understand the way in which the world was both organized and how it functioned. Noting advances in the sciences, the Enlightenment thinkers sought to apply rational thinking as well to government and law and politics. But we must begin with the Renaissance. Here's the famous School of Athens painting by Raphael, which is in the Pope's library in the Vatican. And we want to especially focus on the two central figures, if you go to the next slide, Plato and Aristotle. For those two, way back in antiquity, the time of the Golden Age of Greece, set forth their own views about how to know what is true. Much of the time following these two, it was Plato who dominated Western culture and the area around the Mediterranean, emphasizing, as he's showing here with his finger, the one. Everything derives its meaning from the invisible world of the forms, which all derive their essence ultimately from the one. Whereas Aristotle holds out his hand horizontally, his fingers separated, indicating that the way we arrive at truth is to study the particulars in the world. When we've studied the particulars in the physical world, then we're getting closer to knowing what is true. The Renaissance was a major break from the world of the Middle Ages in Europe, and a number of important concepts emerged. The importance of the individual, a belief in human potential, an interest in the ancient Greek and Roman sources, an interest in nature, the natural world. They were open to other sources of knowledge than just the Bible. Indeed, they could be critical of the church and wanted the church reformed. And Jesus would be seen as a role model to many Renaissance and Renaissance humanist thinkers. These ideas we will see continue forward historically. During the period of the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation began, and it began with Martin Luther and his emphasis on personal salvation. 3 major written works of his were published in 1520. The first, To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. He said that secular rulers are not subject to the church, creating a stronger split between church and state. In his Babylonian Captivity of the Church, he criticized the 7 sacrament system, only holding to 2 sacraments, baptism and communion. And in the third treatise, perhaps the most important, The Freedom of a Christian, he upheld that a Christian is a perfectly free lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. But here we hear the ring of the bell of freedom. In the area of Switzerland, contemporaneous with Luther's Reformation, another branch of the Reformation was occurring, influenced by Luther. And here the leader was Zwingli. Zwingli has been said to be the first modern thinker in that he said that the communion bread and wine were merely symbolic. And thus he was demystifying the Eucharist. And this demystification of Christian ritual and belief will continue on from this point. He believed that Scripture should be the basis of authority, not only for the Christian life, but even for society at large. The reign of Christ, thus, is also political. Important concepts that emerged from the Reformation include a separation of church and state, which we saw with Luther. Luther had emphasized the priesthood of all believers, not just the professional priesthood, and thus the people became important. And this is understood as the movement toward modern democracy. There is an important emphasis on freedom. There is a demystifying of religious rites and a downplaying of anything thought superstitious. But on the other hand, there is this view of the Bible alone as an authority, even for the purpose of reforming society. Following the Renaissance and the Reformation was the scientific revolution. And it actually began somewhat in the Renaissance with Nicolaus Copernicus, who held that the earth was not the center of the cosmos, but the sun was. And this challenged and eventually overcame the old earth-centered view, which was strongly held by the church. Then there is Kepler and his 3 laws of planetary motion, and then one of the most important scientific thinkers of all time, Galileo Galilei, who is famous for his discoveries with the telescope, but also was important because he is the first. Some say Leonardo da Vinci might have been the first, but we truly know that Galileo was early in using experiments and using timing his experiments, timing measurements, really the birth of modern science. And of course, he died a man, Galileo, upset the Catholic Church, but in the long run, his views were accepted. At the same time, there was René Descartes, known as the founder of modern philosophy. He's especially famous for his concept of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Inquiry, thus, the search for truth, in a sense, begins with oneself. He believed in accepting nothing as true unless its truthfulness was self-evident. And that idea made its way even into the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Indeed, the Declaration of Independence is an Enlightenment document. Also, at this time was Francis Bacon, who strongly believed in empiricism, that is, that knowledge is gained through the senses, and here he is following in the footsteps of Aristotle, and thus the inductive experimental method is important. All of these scientists and their ideas ultimately culminated in the work of Sir Isaac Newton, who has studied Descartes and Kepler and Galileo, claiming that he had stood on the shoulders of giants in arriving at his own concepts. He developed calculus and worked with optics and light, but his biggest contribution was his Principia, published in 1687, where he discusses the three laws of motion and the law of universal gravitation. The Principia is one of the most influential books ever written. And thus we come to the Enlightenment, which builds on Bacon, Descartes, and Newton, pursuing the issues of knowledge, certainty, authority, and ultimately unity. This is an extensive quotation from a modern science writer, but it is an important paragraph that will really lead us into the importance of the Enlightenment. Especially note the bottom, where the French Encyclopédie, that is the many volumes of that encyclopedia, a seminal Enlightenment tome, was dedicated to Bacon, Locke, and Newton. Thomas Jefferson in 1789 commissioned a composite portrait of these enthusiasts of science, calling them the three greatest men that have ever lived, without any exception. So we're going to look briefly here at the Enlightenment as it leads us into a certain aspect of the history of the American colonies and then the founding of the United States. Key concepts to note about the European Enlightenment, and you will note that many of these are carried over from the Renaissance and the Reformation. They are the individual as important, the themes of freedom, emancipation, and liberty. Interestingly, the Enlightenment brings in the idea of pleasure, of self-interest, of happiness. Happiness even derived from property. The use of reason is important. An emphasis on ultimately collecting everything into a unity or a union. Nature and what is natural are important. Science is important. Tolerance. We'll see that with John Locke here soon. And the idea that things are getting better and humans are making progress. And then finally, also, is the reorganization of society. And so theories of government emerge during this time. A very important thinker of the early Enlightenment is John Locke. He'll be very important to the founding of the United States. Locke had read Descartes. He was impressed by Descartes' clear and distinct ideas. He was, in fact, a friend of Newton. And he read a number of works on various topics. If you go to the next slide, he was a philosopher, and in his essay concerning human understanding, argued that the human mind at birth is a blank tablet, a tabula rasa, and thus sense perception is very important for Locke, because that's how people build their knowledge. But we especially want to look at the next one, Locke, the political theorist. The next slide. Locke had said that humans are by nature free, equal, and independent, enjoying that liberty of the state of nature. The only thing a person cannot do is violate the law of nature, and not to harm others or their property, which is established by the Creator, for whom they are made to last during His, not one another's pleasure. He held that people are capable of governing themselves through reason. Locke's two treatises of government is very important for our purposes. In this work, he defended the Glorious Revolution in England that had occurred in 1688. He affirmed a form of social contract that was dissoluble. The people have the right to revolt against tyranny. He advocated a limited government, that is, limited by the law of nature. And he recognized three powers of government, which are the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. A government is subject to its citizens, that is, those who govern, governed by consent of the governed. Majority rules. Government exists to protect life, liberty, and property. Society is for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property, he wrote. And thus life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the Declaration of Independence is not far off. Indeed, Jefferson was greatly influenced by Locke. Another important, very important thinker of the Enlightenment was the Baron de Montesquieu, a student of Roman law. And in his Spirit of the Laws, he advocated the English system is best with its separation of powers, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. He was one of the most influential writers on the American founders. Intellectual historian Jacques Barzun has thus concluded, the outcome of what has been reviewed here, late 17th century critical thought, the events of 1688, and the writings of Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, may be summed up in a few points. Divine right is a dogma without basis, that is, divine right of kings. Government grew out of nature itself, from reasonable motives and for the good of the people. Certain fundamental rights cannot be abolished, including property and the right of revolution. There's John Locke. A still shorter roundup could be the political ideas of the English Puritans, aiming at equality and democracy, were now in the mainstream of thought, minus the religious component. Indeed, in England, the Puritans had already been thinking along the lines of Locke. In fact, in my opinion, I think Locke was most certainly influenced by Puritan reflection on governance. Enlightenment thought reached the American colonists via newspapers, books, and tracts, and such ideas spawned an age of learning and innovation in and among the colonies. Of all the colonists, Benjamin Franklin best epitomized Enlightenment ideology, and his study of laws and nature spread to a number of different fields, including medicine, meteorology, geology, physics, and astronomy. In fact, in his own time, he was often referred to as Dr. Franklin. This slide notes a few autobiographical facts about Benjamin Franklin. As you read this, also note, please, the last point. For generations after, he was considered one of the primary U.S. founders, some considering him the father of his country, not Washington. The era of the Enlightenment in America also saw the increase in universities and scientific studies. But note, though, that Harvard and other schools were primarily founded to train ministers. And while scientific and philosophical thought was going on, it would be a while before American institutions of higher learning reached the level of some in Europe. The Enlightenment had many powerful results, one of which was the premise that God was not an active God, but rather more like a clockmaker. He built the cosmos and then set it in motion and doesn't intervene since. This is known as deism. The 5 articles of deism are as follows. Belief that a supreme being exists. Worship of this deity is required, and thus Thomas Jefferson, the deist, regularly attended church. Personal morality is a form of worship. Indeed, may be the most important form of worship for a deist. One must repent of wrongs committed, and one will receive one's just deserts in both this life and the afterlife. An important deist who was born in England and eventually came to the United States was Joseph Priestley. He was a scientist. He is the one who discovered oxygen in 1774. He was Unitarian in his beliefs, rejected traditional doctrines of the atonement and the Trinity, a defender of the French Revolution, which we haven't yet gotten to. Jefferson admired one of his works. Kind of being persecuted in England, he went to America. He influenced some when he came over across the ocean, but among many Christians, they had already been strengthened in their faith by the effects of Scottish common sense realism of Thomas Reid and Princeton College, and the revivalism of the Great Awakening. Ben Franklin was also a well-known deist, but very late in his life, he seems to have modified his deism somewhat. Concerning the Constitutional Convention, he made these remarks concerning prayer. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. That's a little more involvement on the part of the deity for a deist. An interesting statement by Franklin late in his life. Here are some other famous deists. I'll let you read this on your own. We'll cover Thomas Paine in more detail at another time. Standing against so much of the critical thought of the Enlightenment, especially as it was applied to Christianity, was Thomas Reid, professor at the University of Glasgow. He, in fact, took over the position held by Adam Smith, famous economist. And he is the founder of what became known as Scottish common sense realism, which took hold in the American colonies, especially at Princeton. And because of Reid, the United States was less influenced by the radical religious criticism of Europe, such as one might find with Hume. Reid's approach allowed for a reasoned defense of Christian faith. While the Enlightenment was going on in Europe, an amazing event occurred in the English colonies of North America. A major Christian revival began. 1740 to 1742, the high point, and it is called the Great Awakening. There was an emphasis on personal, spiritual regeneration, what today might be called being born again. This revival was extensive in time and in geography. It crossed denominational lines. It crossed colonial lines. Indeed, the revival united the people of the colonies, in a sense, with ramifications for the revolution. more than the Albany Congress, the religious revival that occurred at this time unified the colonies. During this time, indeed, in light of this revival, Princeton was founded. It was founded as the Log College of New Jersey and would eventually become the leading Christian educational institution. Notable preachers and theologians of this Great Awakening included Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, John Wesley, and the Tennant brothers. Jonathan Edwards is the Great Awakening theologian. A Congregationalist with his roots in Puritan New England, he is usually considered America's greatest theologian. Orthodox in his Christian beliefs, he also read deeply from Locke and Newton, the important Enlightenment thinkers. Indeed, he was selected to become Princeton College's first president. However, he died not long after being selected. John Wesley, the British preacher, had a tremendous impact on the religious environment in the colonies, though he only visited once. His message included a message of social justice, and he was an early and outspoken critic of the institution of slavery, as you can see here on this slide. His brother Charles is considered one of the greatest hymn writers in the history of the church. Influenced by Wesley at Oxford was George Whitefield. He is the greatest evangelist of the Great Awakening. He made a number of trips to the colonies, first in 1740, where he met with Jonathan Edwards. He became a friend of the deist Ben Franklin, and indeed, so powerful were his sermons that it is said that Ben Franklin himself even emptied his pockets into the collection plate upon hearing a sermon. The Great Awakening and the Enlightenment had a tremendous impact on the colonies, and this was seen especially in viewing themselves as self-governing, able to govern themselves. Indeed, unlike those in New Spain or New France, English colonials had freedom of religion, freedom to develop and maintain their own tax and trade systems, and in some cases their own administrative agencies. In fact, though, it should be noted that freedom of religion varied from colony to colony. As was noted previously, there wasn't quite the same amount of freedom of religion in Virginia or New England as one might experience in Pennsylvania. This slide notes the foundation for tensions that will emerge between the British colonialists and England itself. The event that sparked colonial discontent with England was the French and Indian War, part of the 7 Years' War, to which we will now turn in the next presentation.